In this video, we'll be creating a program that works with vectors. Vectors are useful for storing similar items in a list. Once you're ready, open up Visual Studio Code and we'll get started. Navigate to your Activities directory. We are on Activity 13, so double-click on A13. Once the activity file loads, review the topic and program requirements. Attempt to implement a solution on your own with the video paused. Once completed, resume the video and I will demonstrate my implementation as well as provide insight to the activity topic. As we can see with this topic, we are working with vectors. Our program requirements indicate that we should print out 10, 20, the word 30, and then 40 from a loop. We also need to print out the total number of elements that are in a vector. Our notes indicate that we should use a vector to store 4 numbers. We should iterate through the vector using a for in loop. We should determine whether to print the number or print out 30 inside the loop. Finally, we should use the .len function to print out the number of elements that are in the vector. To get started, I'm going to copy in the notes into the main function. So our first note indicates that we need to use a vector to store 4 numbers. So I'm going to call my vector my numbers. I'll use the vec macro since it's easy to use, and I'll put in the numbers. Now, even though the requirements state that we need to print out the word 30, we're not able to store that within this vector because vectors can only have a single type. In this case, the vector has an integer type since I'm using numbers. So if I tried to put this 30 as a string right here, it wouldn't work. So we're going to have to check that using match or using if else. Next, we need to iterate through the vector using a for in loop. So the for in loop is constructed using the keyword for, a variable name, the keyword in, and then the name of the collection to iterate through. So this is read as for a number in the collection my numbers do something. So for each thing inside this thing, do some stuff. Within this loop, we need to determine whether to print the number or print 30. I'm going to use a match block for this. So I'll match on the number. If the number is 30, I'm going to do a print line and we'll print out the word 30 per the requirements. If the number is anything else, we're just going to print out the number. So this particular bit of code will work for any numbers, not just the 10, 20, and 40 that we need. Since we're only putting in 10, 20, 30, and 40 in our vector, it will satisfy the requirements though. Lastly, we need to use the .len function to print the number of elements in a vector. To do that, I'm just going to use the print line macro with a helpful message, number of elements. I'll use the debug token, and we'll have my numbers.len to get the length of the vector. The length of the vector contains the number of elements. So here we have 1, 2, 3, 4. So this will be 4 when the code executes, and it'll be placed here, and the message printed will be number of elements equals 4. Before we try running this program, let's step through it from the beginning. We're creating a vector called myNumbers using the vec macro. Alternatively, you can use vector new and then push each element one at a time. However, the vec macro is very convenient, so we're placing 10, 20, and 30 into that vector. We're then iterating through each element within the vector. So for each element, we're giving it a name called num. Inside myNumbers, we're going to execute this code here. We then have a match block, so we match on number. On the first iteration, it's 10. We then check, is it 30? Nope. So it's just going to print it out because this catches everything. On the next iteration, it'll be 20, so it's not 30, it's something else. Print it out. It'll then be 30. This matches, so we'll print out 30. Next, 40 will get checked. It's not 30, it's something else. We will print it out. Finally, after all that's done, this for loop will terminate, move on to the next line, which will just print out the number of elements, and the len will be 4, since we have 4 elements. That'll go there, and it'll print out. If you tried implementing it the same way I did, with the for loop followed by the length of the vector, you may have ran into a compiler error. And the reason for that is when you create a for loop, you're transferring ownership of the information. So initially, my numbers is owned by the main function. When you create a for loop, you're transferring the ownership here into this for loop. What that means is the for loop will execute, and then after all the elements have been iterated through, the for loop ends. We can see here, once the for loop gets here after it's been through all the elements, the my numbers will get dropped because the for loop owns my numbers now. At that point, my numbers is no longer available, and if you try to get the length, it won't work because it was dropped by this for loop. Let's take a look at the compiler error. So we try to run it, and we get a compiler error. The error indicates that we are trying to borrow a moved value. Here we see that the my numbers was moved into this loop, and then we tried to use it later on. To fix this, we're simply just going to borrow my numbers instead. So we use an ampersand to borrow. Now, this for loop is simply borrowing my numbers. The owner is still the main function. The for loop is just borrowing it really quick and then giving it back. And then my numbers will be able to print since it's still owned by the main function and won't get destroyed until we get the end down here. So let's run it one more time and see if it works. And there we go. We have our 10, 20, the word 30, 40, and the number of elements printed out. This concludes the activity on vectors. I'll see you in the next presentation.